The envelope was already sealed when I put on my coat that evening. I'd placed it in the inside pocket that morning after Harlan left my kitchen, and I had not touched it since. I'm not a superstitious man, but I have learned the way men learn things. They cannot unlearn that there is a difference between a decision and a preparation. The decision had been made 3 weeks earlier. The preparation had taken considerably longer. My name is Ephraim Caldwell. I am 68 years old. I have owned the same 412 acres in central Maine for 42 years, and before that, I spent 11 years as a construction worker in Portland, pouring foundations for other men's houses before I had enough saved to buy my own land. The work left marks. My hands carry 3 distinct scars, one across the base of the left thumb from a table saw in 1978, 2 smaller ones on the right palm from a framing accident the following spring. My son used to trace those scars with his finger when he was small. He called them my map. I never corrected him. The land itself is not glamorous. It is rocky in the north quarter, soft near the creek, and the barn needs a new roof every 20 years, whether you like it or not. The farmhouse was built in 1931 by my wife's grandfather, and I have repaired every room in it at least twice. When Eleanor died 11 years ago, I thought about selling. I stood in the back field one October morning and genuinely considered it. Then I went inside, made coffee, and called my son. He drove up from Portland that weekend, and we walked the fence line together without saying much. By Sunday evening, neither of us had mentioned selling again. Some decisions get made in silence. Thaddeus is 41 now. He runs a veterinary practice in Portland, the kind that handles both small animals and the larger farm cases that other clinics turn away. He is good at his work, meticulous and calm, in the way that people who have grown up around animals tend to be. He calls me every Sunday, sometimes twice if the week has been difficult. He still addresses me as sir when the conversation turns serious, a habit he formed as a boy and never discarded. I have never asked him to stop. There are worse inheritances a man can leave his son than a sense of how to speak to someone he respects. 3 weeks before the dinner, he called on a Thursday. That was unusual. I was in the equipment shed, replacing a belt on the old baler, when my phone rang. He said, "Dad, I need to tell you something about Margot." He spoke for about 4 minutes. I listened without interrupting. When he finished, I set down the wrench I was holding and looked out the shed door at the back field, where the light was going, gold and flat, the way it does in late October in Maine. I said, "Are you certain?" He said he was. I said, "Then be ready." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You already knew something, didn't you?" I told him I had observed certain things. That was true. I had been observing Margot Whitmore for the better part of 6 months, not with suspicion exactly, but with the particular attention that comes naturally to a man who spent a decade reading terrain and load-bearing angles before he ever laid a foundation. The first thing I noted was in late August, Thaddeus had brought her to the farm for the weekend, her first visit, as far as I knew, though she moved through the property with the ease of someone who had already walked it in her mind. On the Saturday afternoon, while Thaddeus was in the barn checking on one of the Angus cows, Margot stood with me on the back porch and asked, in a tone she had calibrated to sound casual, how many acres the property ran. I told her 412. She nodded and looked out at the east field. Then she asked whether I'd ever had the land appraised. I said I had, some years back, for estate planning purposes. She asked what it had come in at. I told her I didn't recall the exact figure. That was not entirely true, but I had learned, by then, that the most useful thing you can do when someone asks a question they have no innocent reason to ask is to give them nothing they can build on and watch what they do next. What she did was change the subject smoothly, without missing a beat, to the weather coming in from the coast. I watched her do it and said nothing. I filed the question away the way I file things that don't yet have a place carefully, and without throwing them out. 6 weeks later, mid-October, the fields already going to frost, she came again, this time alone. Thaddeus was at a conference in Portland, and she had driven up. She said because she wanted to see the fall color on the property. That was plausible. The maples along the north fence line are worth seeing in October, but she spent less time looking at the trees than she spent asking Roy Demers, my neighbor, how long I'd owned the land and whether I had any family other than Thaddeus. Roy told me about it the following morning, the way Roy tells me most things standing at the fence line between our properties, without particular emphasis, as though he were reporting on the weather. He said she'd been friendly. He said she'd asked good questions. He said something about her reminded him of a man who'd once tried to buy his own property by starting with the neighbors instead of the owner. I thanked him. He went back to his side of the fence. I went back to mine. You develop an eye for what holds and what doesn't. Margot was charming in the way that some structures are charming, impressive at first assessment, but worth examining more carefully before you commit any weight to them. 2 days after Thaddeus's call, I drove to Harlan Pierce's office in Bangor. Harlan and I have been friends since 1981, when we both served on the volunteer fire board in Penobscot County. He became a lawyer the same year I bought the farm, and we have had occasion to be useful to each other over the decades. I sat across his desk and told him what I needed. He asked 2 questions. I answered them. He opened a drawer, took out a legal pad, and began writing. When he was done, he looked up and said, "You understand what this establishes?" I told him I did. He said, "And the other document?" I said that was the one I needed him to prepare carefully. He nodded and said he would have everything ready within 10 days. He was ready in 8, the morning of the dinner. He came to the farmhouse, and we sat at the kitchen table while he walked me through each page. Eleanor's grandmother had left her china on that table for 30 years. I noticed that detail while Harlan was talking, the blue edge of the serving platter visible through the glass cabinet door. I noticed it the way you notice things when you are very calm and very focused at the same time. When Harlan left, I sealed the envelope. I was not planning to attend a formal dinner. I had understood it to be a family meal. Thaddeus, Margot, her mother Patricia, and myself, at a restaurant in Portland that Margot had selected. I dressed the way I dress when I leave the farm, in the evening clean trousers, the good boots, a flannel shirt I had washed but not ironed because I had been moving hay that afternoon, and the ironing had not seemed urgent. I noticed in the truck's rearview mirror a faint smudge of dust along my collar. I considered going back inside to change. I did not go back inside. I have learned, in 68 years, that most of the things we prepare for arrive differently than we expect. The ground is never quite where the survey said it would be. The load shifts. The weather changes between morning and afternoon. What matters is not the specific preparation, but the quality of attention you bring to it, and whether, when the moment comes, you have already decided what you are willing to lose and what you are not. The envelope sat in my inside pocket. I drove south toward Portland. The road was familiar and the evening was clear, and I did not yet know that by the time I drove home again, everything Margot Whitmore had planned would be sitting on a restaurant table on a single page, in her own words, waiting to be read. The restaurant was called Aldercroft. It sat on the top floor of a converted warehouse on the Portland waterfront, the kind of place where the menus had no prices on the version they handed to guests, only to whoever was paying. Thaddeus had made the reservation 6 weeks earlier at Margot's request. She had specified the table corner, water view, away from the kitchen. I had been to Portland many times in 42 years, mostly for feed supply runs and equipment auctions. I had never been to Aldercroft. I wore the suit I had worn to my wife Ruth's funeral 11 years ago. It still fit. I had pressed it myself that afternoon on the kitchen table. I arrived 7 minutes early. The maitre d', a young man with the particular posture of someone trained to assess people quickly and quietly, looked at me for 1/2 second longer than necessary before he found my name on the list and led me to the table. The dining room was high-ceilinged and dim, with candles on each table and the harbor lights visible through the floor-to-ceiling windows along the west wall. It was a Wednesday evening, and the room was perhaps 2/3 full. I sat down and ordered water. I did not look at the menu. I had learned a long time ago that when you are the first to arrive somewhere unfamiliar, the best use of the time is to learn the room. Thaddeus arrived next, 15 minutes later, and he sat across from me, and we talked about the herd. 2 of the Angus cows had developed a respiratory issue, and he had treated them that morning. He was calm in the way he always was when he was watching something carefully. I did not mention the envelope. He did not ask about it. Margot arrived with her mother 8 minutes after that. Patricia Whitmore was a tall woman in her early 60s, with the kind of posture that announces itself before the person does. She wore a dark blazer and pearl earrings, and she walked through the dining room the way people walk through rooms they have decided belong to them. Margot was behind her, in a green dress, her dark hair pinned up. She was 29 years old, and she was going to marry my son in 6 weeks. And she was beautiful, in the way that certain things are beautiful when you are not yet close enough to see what they are made of. They sat down. Margot took the chair to my left. There was a moment brief, ordinary, where she adjusted her napkin and looked at the menu, and the table arranged itself into something that resembled a family dinner. Patricia ordered sparkling water. Thaddeus poured wine. The conversation moved through the easy early channels, the wedding venue, the weather expected for the weekend, a remark about the drive down from Augusta. I was reaching for the breadbasket when Margot went still. She did not say anything immediately. She turned her head slightly to the left, toward me, and I understood from the change in her posture what she had seen. There was soil on my collar, a faint line of it where the fabric met my neck, left over from the afternoon's work in the East Field. I had noticed it when I changed. I decided it was not worth the second shirt. She stood up. She said, quietly, but not quietly enough, "Excuse me for a moment." And she touched Thaddeus on the shoulder and tilted her head toward the small corridor that led to the restrooms. Thaddeus followed her. I watched the candle on the table. The flame moved once, then steadied. The table to our right seated 4 women celebrating something. There was a small arrangement of flowers in the center, and one of them had a gold ribbon tied around her wine glass. The woman nearest to me was perhaps 45, with reading glasses pushed up on her head. I had placed her over the course of the evening. As someone who knew this restaurant well, she'd greeted the sommelier by name when he came to the table, and he had responded with the particular warmth reserved for regulars. Later, when Simone came to clear our bread plates, she had leaned over and said something to the woman that made her laugh. And the woman had touched Simone's arm briefly in the way that people touch the arms of people they have known for years. Her name, I would learn afterward from Simone, was Dr. Constance Aldrich. She taught at the Maine College of Art and had been coming to Aldercroft for 11 years. She was, in other words, exactly the kind of person whose opinion of an evening carried weight in this room, and in the rooms connected to it. The woman nearest to me was perhaps 45, with reading glasses pushed up on her head. She was not looking at our table directly, but I noticed her attention shift when Margot and Thaddeus stepped away. People in restaurants always notice when someone leaves a table mid-conversation. It is one of those small social disturbances, like a chair scraping, that the room registers without meaning to. I could hear Margot's voice from the corridor. Not every word the room had enough ambient sound to blur the edges, but enough. I heard embarrassing. I heard barn. I heard the phrase crawled out of, and then the word soil, and then the word sweat. I heard my son say nothing in response. I heard Margot say, "I can't sit next to him for an entire dinner. Thaddeus, it's embarrassing. He looks like he just crawled out of a barn." Thaddeus came back to the table alone. He sat down. He picked up his wine glass and set it down without drinking from it. Margot returned 30 seconds later. She did not sit. She stood at the end of the table between her chair and mine, and she looked at me with the particular expression of someone who has decided that the most efficient solution is the direct one. The dining room did not go silent. The ambient sound continued silverware, low conversation, the soft percussion of a kitchen somewhere behind a wall. But the table to our right went quiet. The woman with the reading glasses on her head looked up. Margot said, "I'm sorry, but I'm not going to sit next to a man who smells like soil and sweat for an entire dinner. It's not fair to anyone at this table." She said it at a volume that was not quite a declaration, but was not a private remark either. It was the volume of someone who has made a calculation about how much of the room they want to reach. He looks like he came here straight from the fields. He is, I'm sorry, but he is worthless dirt. Literally. That's what he is. Worthless dirt. The phrase landed in the room the way a glass lands when it falls not shattering, but heard. Dr. Aldrich did not look away. She set her wine glass down with a precision that had nothing to do with the wine. The man at the table behind Patricia had paused mid-sentence. A server near the window had slowed her walk without stopping. Patricia set down her sparkling water. She looked at her daughter, then at me, and then she said, with the measured satisfaction of someone confirming a position they had held for some time, "Margot has a point. Some people simply don't belong in places like this. It's not a criticism, it's just a matter of context." I set my fork down. Not because my hand shook, because I needed a moment to be certain it would not. I had known this was possible, not this exact shape, not these exact words, but something in this direction. I had understood for several months what Margot Whitmore thought of me, and I had understood it not from what she said to my face, but from what she said when she believed I could not hear her. The envelope in my inside pocket had been assembled from exactly that kind of understanding. But knowing a thing and sitting inside it are different experiences. My left hand, resting on the tablecloth beside my plate, was not entirely still. The tendons across the back of it shifted once. I pressed my palm flat against the cloth and felt the texture of the linen, and I counted, without moving my lips, from 1 to 4. Ruth had taught me that. She had learned it from her own father, who had worked a harder life than mine and had needed the technique more often. "You count," she had told me once, not because the counting does anything, but because it gives the feeling somewhere to go while you decide what to do with it. I did not look up at Margot. I looked at the candle. The flame had steadied again after the movement of people around the table, and it burned in a clean, narrow column, and I thought about the east field and the particular quality of the soil there in late afternoon, dark and dense, and smelling of iron and old rain, and how it had taken me and Ruth 17 years to understand that field well enough to stop fighting it and start working with it instead. Thaddeus had not spoken. He was looking at the tablecloth in front of him. I picked up my fork. I cut a small piece from the bread roll on my plate. I ate it. The bread was warm and tasted of rosemary and cost. I estimated more per roll than a full loaf from the bakery in Skowhegan, where I had been buying bread for 30 years. I did not look at Margot. I did not look at Patricia. I did not say a word. Margot sat back down, not in her original chair, but in the one to Thaddeus's right, one seat farther from me. She shook out her napkin with a small, precise motion and picked up her menu. Patricia straightened her blazer. The server appeared and asked if we were ready to order. The table to our right resumed its conversation. Dr. Aldrich did not look at me again, but I noticed that she had leaned slightly toward the woman beside her and said something in a low voice, and the other woman glanced briefly in our direction and then back at Dr. Aldrich, and neither of them looked at Margot at all. The dinner continued. I ate the bread. I drank the water. I kept my hand steady. The envelope in my inside pocket was exactly where I had put it that morning, and it would stay there for a while longer yet, and the words on the page inside it were not going anywhere. Some things, once said aloud in a room full of people, cannot be unsaid. That is not a comfort in the moment. In the moment, it is simply a fact. Like the weight of soil, like the way a field holds water after rain, like the particular smell of a barn at the end of a long day's work. I have spent 42 years learning to tell the difference between what needs to be answered immediately and what will answer itself, given enough time and the right conditions. I finished the bread. I reached for the menu. The harbor lights were steady through the window, and the evening was not yet over. Thaddeus set his fork down the way a man sets down something he has been holding for too long, not with force, not with ceremony. He simply opened his fingers and let it rest against the edge of the plate, and the sound it made, that small, clean click of metal on porcelain, traveled in the way that quiet sounds travel in a room that has gone very still. I heard it from where I sat. I think everyone did. He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket with the same unhurried motion I had watched him use since he was a boy, reaching into his coat for his school keys on cold mornings. He produced a single page folded once, lengthwise, and set it on the table in front of him without opening it. He did not look at Margot. He did not look at Patricia. He looked at the page, and then he looked up at the harbor lights through the window, and his face was entirely still. I was already standing. I did not make a production of it. I pushed back my chair, folded my napkin once, and set it beside the bread plate, and walked toward the far corner of the room, near the kitchen corridor. I had eaten at Harborview 41 times in the past 12 years. I knew the corner table. I knew the particular way the ceiling tiles caught the kitchen light, 14 of them, slightly uneven along the eastern wall, one replaced after a water leak in the winter of 2019. I had counted them the first time I sat there, the night after Eleanor's funeral, when Harlan Pierce had brought me here and told me to eat something, and I had not been able to think of a reason to refuse. I sat down in the same chair I always used, back to the wall, facing the room. Simone reached the table before I had finished settling in. She was the floor manager, had been for 7 years, since the previous owner retired and the Beaumont family took over the lease. She was a compact woman with dark hair and the particular efficiency of someone who had learned to read a room at a glance rather than a sentence at a time. She set a glass of water in front of me and said, without any particular emphasis, "Your usual table, Mr. Caldwell. The chef has prepared your favorite. Should I let him know you're ready?" I told her I would need a few minutes. She nodded once, glanced toward the larger table where the Whitmore party was seated, and moved away without comment. She had the discretion of someone who understood that some evenings in a restaurant are not simply evenings in a restaurant. I did not look at the table directly. I have learned, over a long working life, that looking directly at a thing is often the least useful way to observe it. A field tells you more about its water table from the edges than from the center. A structure tells you more about its load-bearing capacity from the foundation than from the roof. I looked at the harbor lights. I looked at the ceiling tiles. I counted them again, 14, and then I looked at my hands on the table, which were the hands of a man who had spent 4 decades working soil and timber and stone, and which showed it. At the larger table, Margot said something to Thaddeus in a low voice. I could not hear the words, but I could read the shape of them, a question with an edge on it. Thaddeus did not answer. He was looking at the folded page in front of him. She leaned slightly toward him and said something again, and this time her mother looked up from the table as well. Patricia Whitmore had the posture of a woman who had spent her life in rooms where posture was evaluated, and she had been using it all evening as a kind of armor. But armor is most visible when the person wearing it becomes uncertain about what it is meant to protect against. Margot turned her head and looked across the room toward my corner table. I could see her expression from where I sat, the slight narrowing, the recalibration. She said something to Thaddeus. The shape of it was a question about me. Who? That old man. Something in that register. Thaddeus did not answer. He picked up the folded page, smoothed it once against the tablecloth, and held it in both hands without yet opening it. The gesture was unhurried. It had the quality of a man who has decided on a course of action and is no longer in any particular hurry, because the hurrying is finished, and what remains is simply the doing. Patricia's eyes moved from Thaddeus to the page to my corner table, and back to the page. She had not touched her wine in several minutes. Her hands were in her lap. There was a question forming in her expression, not the sharp, dismissive question of a woman who believes she already knows the answer, but the slower, more uncomfortable question of a woman who is beginning to suspect she may not. Simone appeared at my elbow with a small plate of bread and the olive oil I had not ordered, because she had been bringing it unrequested for 11 years. She set it down quietly. I thanked her. She said, "He's holding it well. Your son." And then she moved away before I could determine whether she had meant it as an observation or as something else. I tore a piece of bread. The kitchen smelled of garlic and something slow roasted, and the harbor lights were steady. And across the room, my son held a single page in both hands with the patience of a man who had learned patience from someone who had learned it from 42 years of working land that did not hurry for anyone. The page was not yet open. It did not need to be, yet. The evening had its own timing, and I had stopped trying to rush evenings a long time ago. I counted the ceiling tiles one more time. Still 14. Some things stay where you put them. The kitchen door swung open briefly, the kind of swing that happens when someone pushes through carrying plates, and I saw him in the gap before it closed again. Chef Marcus. He was a tall man with a shaved head and forearms that looked like they'd spent time doing something other than cooking before he found his way into a kitchen. He was moving toward the pass-through with 2 plates balanced on his left arm when he glanced out into the dining room. He stopped. Not long. A second, maybe 2. His eyes found me at the corner table, and he gave one slow nod, the kind that doesn't require explanation, the kind that one working man gives another when words would be redundant. Then the door swung back, and he was gone. I broke off another piece of bread and didn't look up. Margot had seen it. I knew because I heard her voice drop in that particular way. Voices drop when something has interrupted a person's certainty. She said, "Why is the chef bowing to your father?" Thaddeus didn't answer. I had taught him, without ever teaching him directly, that silence after a question is not the same as ignorance. He set his water glass down and looked at it. Thaddeus. Her voice had a new register now, not the bright contempt from before, something more careful. "I'm asking you a question." He looked up at her. He said, "I heard you." That was all. Patricia had turned slightly in her chair. She was a woman who processed status the way accountants process numbers, automatically, involuntarily, without needing to be asked. I had watched her all evening. I knew what she was doing now. She was recalculating. She knew Thaddeus had a good practice. She knew what a veterinary practice in Portland brought in. She had already filed that figure somewhere and considered it satisfactory. But the chef of an establishment like this one, a place with a wine list that ran to 12 pages, did not pause his work to nod at a farmer's father unless that farmer's father was something more than a farmer's father. She was quiet in a way that was different from her earlier quiet. Simone came back to the table then. She was carrying nothing, just returning, the way a good manager returns, to confirm that everything was as it should be. She touched the edge of the table lightly and addressed Thaddeus first, then let her eyes move to Margot and Patricia with the practiced neutrality of someone who has seen every kind of dinner table in 20 years of managing rooms like this one. She said, "I wanted to make sure you'd had a chance to look at the provenance notes on the menu. Your father's farm is one of the largest in Maine. We source our produce from him for about 6 years now. The root vegetables, most of the greens through summer. Chef Marcus is particular about his suppliers." She said it the way she might say that the fish was flown in from the coast, or that the wine was from a small producer in the Willamette Valley, a fact of the establishment, not a compliment, simply the way things were. Then she said, "Enjoy your evening," and moved on to the next table. The silence that followed was a different kind of silence than any that had come before it. Margot's face did not collapse. That is not how realization works, not in people like her. It shifted the way a landscape shifts when the light changes, when you suddenly see the depth you hadn't registered before. She looked at me, then at Thaddeus, then back at me. I was looking at my bread. Patricia set her fork down, not loudly, quietly, with a precision that suggested she was giving herself time to think. 6 years. One of the largest in Maine. She understood supply chains. She had mentioned earlier that her late husband had worked in distribution. She understood what it meant to be a preferred supplier to a restaurant of this caliber. She understood now. The arithmetic of what her daughter had said an hour ago in a voice loud enough for half the room to hear. I did not look at either of them. The harbor lights were still steady through the window. The ceiling still had 14 tiles. Some things stay where you put them, and some things, once said, stay where they were, said hanging in the air of a room long after the person who said them has understood they cannot take them back. I tore the last piece of bread and finished it. There are things you don't talk about in farm country, not because you're ashamed of them, but because talking changes nothing and the work still needs doing either way. 15 years ago, I had a 1987 Ford F-25. Oh, that I'd kept in better condition than most men keep their marriages. Dark green, rebuilt engine, new clutch I'd put in myself in the barn over a February weekend when the temperature didn't get above 12 degrees. I'd driven that truck to every field I'd ever worked, every hardware store run, every hospital visit when Eleanor was sick. The seat on the driver's side had a crack in the leather that I'd repaired 3 times with a kit from the farm supply store in Ellsworth. It still ran the way a thing runs when someone has paid attention to it for a long time. In September of that year, I sold it to a man named Boyd Rutherford who had a property outside of Bangor. I asked for what it was worth. Not more. Boyd paid in a cashier's check, which I deposited the same afternoon. I said nothing to Thaddeus. I told him the truck had developed transmission problems, and I decided to let it go. He was 22 years old and had just received his acceptance letter to the veterinary program at Tufts, and he had enough to carry without knowing what I'd done to help him carry it. I found out 3 years later that he'd learned the truth from Roy Demers, who farmed the property adjacent to mine and had seen Boyd drive the truck away the morning of the sale. Roy had mentioned it in passing, the way people in small places mention things not to wound, just to acknowledge that they'd seen. Thaddeus never said anything to me about it. Not once, not directly, but a year after I found out he knew. He drove up from Bangor on a Saturday in March and spent the weekend helping me re-side the east wall of the barn without being asked. We worked 2 days in the cold, and he never explained why he'd come, and I never asked. Some conversations happen in the doing of things, not in the saying of them. I thought about that truck on the drive home from the restaurant. I thought about how Boyd Rutherford had handed me the check with both hands, the way a man does when he understands he's getting something worth more than what he's paying. I thought about the crack in the driver's seat that I'd never gotten around to fixing a 4th time, and I thought about the phone call Thaddeus had made to me 3 weeks ago, on a Tuesday evening in early October, when the fields had already gone to frost and the light was the color it gets in Maine when the year is finishing. He'd been on call at the clinic in Bangor. He told me later that he'd been in the middle of a routine examination when his phone had buzzed and he'd seen Margot's name on the screen. He'd let it go to voicemail. Then, something he couldn't explain. What exactly made him call back before he listened to the message? The call went through, but Margot didn't speak. He could hear her voice, and another voice he recognized as her friend Delaney's, and he understood after a moment that she'd called him accidentally while already talking. He listened for 40 seconds. He told me he counted them. What he heard, in Margot's voice, clear and unhurried, the way a person speaks when they believe they are entirely alone. Once we marry Thaddeus, we'll convince him to sell that farm. It's just land we can get $50 million easy and move to Boston. He ended the call. He stood in the examination room with the phone in his hand for what he described as a very long time, though he thought it was probably less than a minute. Then he called me. When I heard his voice, I knew something had shifted. Thaddeus does not call in the middle of a workday without reason. He said, "Dad, she wants to sell your farm." He said it plainly, without drama, the way he'd been taught to deliver difficult information directly, without softening it into something easier than it was. I was standing at the kitchen window. The back field was brown and flat under the October sky. My grandfather had cleared that field by hand in 1931 with a team of 2 horses and a determination I'd spent my whole life trying to understand. My father had planted it for the first time in 1953, I had worked it every season since 1982. I was quiet for a moment, not because I didn't know what to say, but because some information needs a second to settle before you decide what to do with it. Then I said, "Thaddeus, I need you to do something for me." I called Harlan Pierce the following morning. Harlan and I had known each other since we were both 19 years old and working the same construction crew outside of Augusta before he went to law school and I came back to the farm. He had a practice in Portland now, estate law and property, and he had handled Eleanor's will and the property trust and every piece of paper that mattered to me for the last 30 years. When I told him what I needed, he was quiet in the particular way that Harlan gets quiet when he is thinking carefully. I said, "I need you to prepare a document, just one page, something that will show everyone exactly who Margot Whitmore really is." He said, "You sure about this?" I said, "I've been sure for 68 years. What I meant was I have spent 68 years learning the difference between what people say and what they mean, and between what they want and what they deserve. I have learned it in fields and in courthouses and in hospital waiting rooms and at kitchen tables at 2 in the morning. I was not going to spend whatever time I had left pretending I hadn't learned it." Harlan understood. He always had. The plan was not complicated. Thaddeus and I sat at my kitchen table on a Thursday evening with 2 cups of coffee and worked through it in less than an hour. I would come to the dinner as I was a man who had spent the morning doing what I always did on a Saturday morning, which was work. I would not explain myself or apologize for my boots or my hands or the way I smelled of the land I'd spent my life on. If Margot wanted to show who she was, I would give her the room to do it. People always do when they believe they have the advantage. Thaddeus would carry the page Harlan had prepared. He would wait. He would read the table and choose the moment. And I trusted him to choose it because he had his mother's instinct for timing and had never once in his life acted before he understood what he was acting into. The page itself was simple. Harlan had printed the email thread in full Margot's messages to Delaney over the previous 6 weeks, recovered from a shared account she had apparently forgotten Thaddeus still had access to. The 50 million. Boston. He won't even know what hit him. Every word in her own hand. Time-stamped, unambiguous, requiring no interpretation from anyone in the room. I did not tell Thaddeus what to say when he gave it to her. I told him to say nothing at all and to let her read it herself. Some things you let people discover on their own. The discovering is the point. I finished my coffee and washed the cup and set it in the rack. Thaddeus folded the page once and put it in the inside pocket of his jacket. We did not shake hands or embrace. We turned off the kitchen light and went to our separate rooms, and the farm was quiet around us the way it gets quiet in October, when everything that needed to grow has grown, and what's left is just the waiting. The dinner had not ended. That surprised me. I had expected Margot to leave to make some excuse about a headache or an early morning, to pull her mother by the elbow and disappear into the parking lot with whatever dignity she could salvage. But she stayed. She smoothed her napkin across her lap and reached for her water glass and stayed. I watched her make the calculation. I recognized it the way you recognize weather coming in from the coast, the particular stillness before a system moves through. She had said what she said, and the room had shifted around her, and now she was deciding whether to retreat or to advance. Margot Whitmore was not the kind of woman who retreated. She crossed the restaurant to the corner table where I was sitting. She moved with the same ease she always projected, shoulders back, chin level, the posture of someone who had never once been told no by a room. She pulled out the chair across from me and sat down without asking. "Mr. Caldwell," she said, "I apologize. I was just being silly." I looked at her. I did not say anything. She held my gaze for a moment, then looked down at the table. A small adjustment, the first I'd seen her make all evening. "It's been a long week," she said. "I wasn't myself." I picked up my water glass and drank from it and set it back down. The ice had mostly melted. The restaurant around us had gone back to its ordinary noise silverware, low conversation, the kitchen door swinging open and closed. I waited. Margot tried again. She had a particular way of softening her voice when she needed something, dropping it half a register, tilting her head slightly, as though she were confiding rather than asking. "Your farm is really impressive," she said. "I'd love to learn more about it someday." She paused, just long enough to make the next part sound natural. "Who will inherit it after you?" I set my glass down. "That's an interesting question, Margot," I said. "What makes you curious about it?" She blinked. She'd expected an answer, a number, a name, a percentage, something she could carry back to her mother and arrange into a plan. My question put the weight back on her side of the table, and she felt it. I watched her feel it. "Well," she said. She smoothed the edge of the tablecloth with 2 fingers. "I just want to know about my future. As Thaddeus's wife, I should know about family assets." "Right. It's a reasonable thing to understand. Family assets, not Thaddeus's work, or his happiness, or what kind of life they might build together on 30 acres of Maine soil. Assets." The word arrived clean and unambiguous, the way a stone breaks the surface of still water. I did not respond immediately. I've spent 42 years reading land and weather and the particular silence of animals before a storm. I know what it means when something reveals itself without meaning to. I looked at Margot, and I thought about the morning I had broken ground on the east pasture fence, my hands bleeding by noon, the post driver jammed, rain coming in from the northwest, and my wife calling from the porch that dinner would wait as long as it needed to. I thought about what it meant to build something that lasts. I said nothing. I looked at my water glass. Across the room, Patricia had gone quiet. She was watching her daughter from the other table, not with approval, the way she had been watching her all evening, but with something different, something slower. She had her wine glass in her hand, but she had stopped drinking from it. She was listening. I had seen that expression before, not on Patricia's face specifically, but on the face of every person who has ever loved someone and begun, in a single unguarded moment, to see them clearly. It is not a pleasant expression. It is the expression of a person who is revising something they believed to be settled. Patricia was watching Margot ask a man she had insulted an hour ago about his inheritance, and she was understanding, perhaps for the first time, exactly what her daughter had come to this dinner to find. Not Thaddeus, not a life, not a family. The word Margot had used was assets. Margot had not noticed her mother watching. She was still looking at me, still waiting for an answer, still holding the posture of a woman who expected to be given what she asked for. There was something almost admirable in the consistency of it. She had been certain all evening, and she was certain now, even here, even after everything. "Mr. Caldwell," she said again. Her voice had dropped another register. "I'm not trying to be inappropriate. I'm just trying to plan." I looked at her for a long moment. Then I picked up my water glass and finished what was left of it and set it back down on the ring it had already made on the tablecloth. "I know," I said. That was all I said. I did not explain what I knew. I did not tell her that planning was exactly the right word for it, or that I had been doing the same thing myself for the better part of 3 months, or that the page folded inside my son's jacket represented a kind of planning she had not anticipated and could not now undo. I let her sit with the 2 words and decide what to do with them. Margot looked at me. Then she looked at her hands. Then she looked across the room at her mother. And Patricia looked back at her. And something passed between them that I was not meant to see, and saw anyway. Patricia set her wine glass down very carefully on the table. Thaddeus stood up slowly. He did not push his chair back with any force or drama. He simply rose, the way a man rises when he has been sitting for a long time and has decided that the sitting is finished. He straightened his jacket with one hand. He was 34 years old, and he had his mother's eyes and my hands wide across the knuckles, built for work, and in that moment he looked more like her than he had in years. The room did not go quiet all at once. It went quiet in stages, the way a field goes quiet before a storm, one sound dropping away and then another, until the only thing left was the low hum of the kitchen behind the swinging door and the faint clink of someone's fork at a table near the window. "Dad," Thaddeus said, He looked at me, not at Margot. "I think it's time." I nodded once. He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and removed a single folded page. Not an envelope. Not a document with a seal or a ribbon or any of the formal trappings that Margot and her mother might have expected from a legal proceeding. Just a page, folded twice. The kind of thing a man prints out at his kitchen table at 11 o'clock at night because he needs to hold it in his hands before he decides what to do with it. He set it on the table in front of Margot. She looked at it the way you look at something you don't recognize but feel you should. Her hand moved toward it and then stopped. Patricia, across the table, leaned forward slightly, her reading glasses still hanging from the chain around her neck. Margot picked up the page and unfolded it. I watched her eyes move to the top of the page. I watched them stop. The page was an email, printed from a phone. From the looks of the formatting, the text slightly compressed, the header showing a timestamp and a name. The name was Emma Voss. The date was 3 weeks before the engagement dinner. The subject line was blank. The first line read, "Once we marry Thaddeus, we'll convince him to sell that farm. It's just land. We can get 50 million easy." Margot's face did not collapse immediately. It went through several things in quick succession: recognition, then calculation, then something that was almost anger before it became something closer to fear. The color left her face the way water leaves a glass that has been tipped too far, slowly, and then all at once. Patricia said, "What is it? Let me," and reached across the table. Margot did not hand it to her. She held it, and Patricia had to take it from her fingers. And when Patricia read the first line, her face went a shade paler than her daughter's. "This is," Patricia started. She stopped. She looked at Thaddeus. "This can't be real." "It's real," Thaddeus said. His voice was very even. He had my voice. In that moment, the voice I used when I was reading a structural report and had found the number I had been looking for and did not need to say anything else about it. "And there's more." Patricia turned the page over. On the back, also printed, was a second block of text. This one was formatted differently, a message sent from a different address. The kind of address you create when you want something to look personal rather than professional. The recipient was listed only as Mom. The text read, "I don't care about Thaddeus. I just need his name on the deed. Then I can sell the farm and leave him. By the time he figures it out, it'll be done." Patricia set the page down on the table. She did not set it down carefully, the way she had set her wine glass down a few minutes before. She set it down the way you set something down when your hands have stopped cooperating with the rest of you. The table near us, Dr. Aldrich's table, where the celebration had gone quiet some time ago, was close enough that I could see her lean toward the woman beside her and say something very quietly. She looked at the page on the table. She looked at Margot. She looked away. She looked at the page on the table. She looked at Margot. She looked away. Simone had come through the door from the back hallway. She was standing near the host station, and I did not know how long she had been there, but she was not moving, and she was not pretending to look at the reservation book. She was looking at the page on the table, and at Thaddeus, and her expression was the expression of someone who has just had a thing confirmed that she had already half believed. Through the round window of the kitchen door, I could see Chef Marcus had stopped moving. He was watching through the glass. Margot said, "That's private." Her voice had changed entirely. The performance quality was gone. What was left was something smaller and harder and not particularly sympathetic. "You had no right to—" "You sent it from your own account," Thaddeus said, "to Emma Voss's personal email 3 weeks ago. I have the full thread." He paused. "Emma and I went to the same veterinary conference in Portland 2 years ago. She reached out to me last month. She said she thought I should know what was being planned." Margot looked at him. Something moved across her face that I can only describe as the look of a person who has just understood completely how a thing went wrong, not the moral dimension of it, not the harm caused, but the specific mechanical failure that led to exposure. She was calculating, even now, even here. "Thaddeus," she said, and her voice shifted again, softer this time. reaching for something. This is out of context. Emma doesn't understand how I talk when I'm... There are 14 more messages in the thread, Thaddeus said. I didn't print all of them. I thought one page was enough. Patricia had not spoken since she set the page down. She was sitting very straight, which I had noticed was what she did when she was working to maintain the appearance of composure. Her wine glass was still where she had placed it, precisely parallel to the edge of the table. She was looking at Margot, not at Thaddeus, not at me. The look was not warm. The room had not recovered its noise. People were not staring openly. This was the kind of restaurant where people had been taught not to stare openly, but the conversations that had resumed after Margot's earlier outburst had gone quiet again. And, this time, they stayed quiet. A busboy near the far wall had stopped clearing a table. He was holding a stack of side plates and not moving. I had not said anything since I nodded at my son. I did not say anything now. I sat with my coffee, which had gone cold, and I watched my son stand in the middle of that room and let the page speak for itself. That was the thing about preparation, not the confrontation, the preparation, the 3 months of patience, the phone call from Emma Voss that Thaddeus had taken seriously when another man might have dismissed it, the evening at Harlan's kitchen table, going through the thread line by line to identify what was relevant and what was not, the decision to print only one page, because one page was enough. All of that work had produced a single sheet of paper lying on a white tablecloth in a restaurant in Portland, and Margot's own words doing the only thing they had ever been capable of doing, which was telling the truth about her. Not my truth, not Thaddeus's truth, hers. Margot looked at the page. She did not pick it up again. She looked at her mother, and this time Patricia did not look back. Patricia was looking at the tablecloth. I think, Thaddeus said, addressing neither of them in particular, we're done here. He reached across the table and picked up the page. He folded it along its original creases twice, neatly, and returned it to his jacket pocket. Then he sat back down next to me, picked up his water glass, and drank. I stood up slowly. My knees don't move the way they did when I was 40, and the chair scraped against the floor loud enough that 2 tables nearby glanced over. I didn't mind. I'd learned a long time ago that the sound of a man getting to his feet is worth paying attention to. There's one more thing you should know. Margot, I said. She looked up at me. Her hands, still flat on the tablecloth, had gone still in a way that reminded me of a deer in the field at first light that moment, just before it decides whether to run. The farm, I said, I transferred it to the Maine Farmland Trust 3 weeks ago. It's no longer mine to sell or to give away. The stillness broke, not all at once. Her face changed the way a field floods after a long rain, slowly at first, then faster than you can account for. The color left her cheeks. Her mouth opened, closed, opened again. You can't do that, she said. I did it 3 weeks ago, I said. The day after Thaddeus told me what you said. I didn't raise my voice. There was nothing to raise it for. The facts were already in the room. They didn't need my anger to carry them. Margot pushed back from the table. You don't understand. I love Thaddeus. This isn't about money. She said it quickly, the way people say things they've rehearsed but no longer believe. You can't just the trust doesn't. There are legal ways to... She stopped, because the email was still in Thaddeus's jacket pocket, and she knew it. And everyone at that table knew it, and the words she had written were not the words of a woman who loved a man without conditions attached to the land beneath his feet. Simone had stepped back from the table. I noticed her, the way I noticed things at the edges, a habit from 40 years of watching weather move across open ground. She was standing near the service corridor with her hands folded in front of her, watching without watching. The way a person does when they understand they are witnessing something that belongs to the people in front of them. Patricia made a sound I hadn't expected. Not words. Just a sound low and involuntary, the kind that comes before crying. When the body understands something, the mind is still refusing. She pressed 2 fingers to her mouth. She was looking at her daughter, and her daughter was not looking back. And I think in that moment, Patricia saw something she had perhaps always been able to avoid seeing until now. Thaddeus set down his water glass. He turned to Margot with the same steadiness he'd had all evening, the same steadiness I'd watched him build over 34 years, one hard season at a time. "Margot," he said, "we're done. The wedding is canceled." No anger in it, no performance, just a door, closing on its own weight. Margot said his name once, then she said it again. He didn't answer either time. He reached for the bread on his side plate, broke a small piece off, and set the rest back down. A thing so ordinary, it was almost unbearable to watch. I sat back down. The candle between us had burned low enough that the wax had pooled at the base of the holder. I looked at it for a moment. 42 years of farming teaches you that some things, once used, don't come back. You don't mourn them. You note them, and you move on to what needs doing next. The room was very quiet around our table. Margot left the restaurant without her coat. I noticed because it was the kind of April night in Maine when the temperature drops fast after dark, and the coat, a cream-colored wool thing she'd draped over her chair at the start of the evening, was still hanging there when Simone came to clear the table. Simone folded it over her arm without a word. She looked at me once. I gave her a small nod. That was all that needed to pass between us. I drove home on Route 9 with the windows down. The fields on either side were dark, the soil turned over from the week's work, and I could smell it, that particular smell of Maine earth in early spring, cold and mineral and alive underneath. I'd been smelling it for 42 years. It still meant something to me. That was the thing about land. It didn't care what happened at dinner tables. It just kept being what it was. Thaddeus called me the next morning at 6:15. I was already in the barn. "She tried to call me 11 times last night," he said. "I didn't pick up." "I know," I said. "She sent an email at 2 in the morning. I didn't open it." "That's fine." He was quiet for a moment. I could hear the sound of his clinic in the background, the low hum of equipment, the distant sound of an animal, something small and frightened. He'd built that clinic with his own savings and 12-hour days for 3 years running. I had never once heard him complain about the hours. She came to the clinic this morning," he said. "Stood in the parking lot for 20 minutes. Janet, my front desk, she called me in the back to let me know. I asked Janet to tell her I was with a patient." He paused. "I was with a patient." He came back to that part of the story on Sunday when he drove up for dinner. He told it the way he tells things he has already decided how to feel about steadily, without drama, the way you describe a procedure that went as it needed to go. He said that after the first patient, Margot had still been in the lot. He had finished 2 more examinations. When he came out to the reception area at noon, Janet told him Margot had come inside and asked to wait. She was sitting in one of the chairs along the wall, the kind of chairs meant for people with anxious animals in their laps. She did not have an animal. She stood up when she saw him. He said he stopped in the middle of the reception area. Janet was at the desk. A woman with a terrier in a carrier was seated 2 chairs down from where Margot had been waiting. He said he was aware of all of them. Margot said his name. She said she needed 5 minutes. He said, "There's nothing to talk about." She said the email was out of context. She said Emma had misunderstood her. She said she loved him. He looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "I heard you say it yourself. Margot, on the phone. I counted the seconds." He said it quietly enough that only she could hear it. Then he turned to Janet and said he had a 1:30 appointment and to send them back when they were ready. He went through the door to the examination rooms and did not look back. Janet told him afterward that Margot sat back down in the chair for about 3 minutes. Then she left. "Good," I said. "Dad." "Yes." "I'm sorry I didn't see through her sooner." I set down the feed bucket I'd been holding. Outside the barn door, the light was coming up gray and slow over the east field, the way it does in April when the sky can't quite decide what it wants to be. "You saw through her when it mattered," I said. "That's all that matters." He didn't answer right away. I've learned over the years that some silences from your children are the same as speaking. This was one of those. "Come for dinner on Sunday," I said. "I'll make the lamb stew." "Yeah," he said. "Okay." Margot's losses came in the order these things always do, quietly at first, then all at once. The restaurant sent her a bill for the private room and the canceled courses, $430. She paid it, according to Simone, who mentioned it to me 3 weeks later without my asking. Harlan's office sent her a letter outlining the legal exposure created by the email, the written record of her own intentions, her own words, time-stamped and preserved. She retained an attorney of her own. Harlan told me, without volunteering more than I needed to know, that the letter his office had sent outlined 3 specific exposures: the written record of intent to defraud a property transfer, the documented plan to dissolve the marriage within a defined window after the deed changed hands, and a clause in Maine property law that treats written evidence of predatory intent in a marriage contract as grounds for civil action by the injured party. The letter gave her 45 days to respond through counsel. Her attorney, a man from a firm in Augusta that Harlan described as competent but not inexpensive, filed a response on day 43. The back and forth ran through the better part of 4 months. I don't know the final figure, but Harlan said, without elaborating, that it was the kind of number that changes a person's plans for the following year. The thing that finished her socially was the email itself. She had sent it to Thaddeus from her personal account, and Thaddeus had forwarded it to exactly 3 people before the evening, at the restaurant Harlan, myself, and a woman named Dora Fitch, who had been Margot's closest friend since college. Thaddeus had not asked Dora to share it. He had sent it to her because Dora had called him 2 weeks prior, worried, saying she'd heard Margot say things about the Caldwell property that didn't sit right. He wanted Dora to know she'd been right to worry. Dora shared it. I don't know exactly how widely, but I know that by the end of May, Margot had stopped attending the dinner parties she'd been attending for 4 years. Whether she withdrew herself or was quietly uninvited, I couldn't say. I didn't ask. It wasn't my business. The email had been her words. She'd chosen every one of them. Patricia came to see me on a Tuesday afternoon, 2 weeks after the dinner. I was mending fence line along the north pasture when I saw her car, a silver sedan, out of place on the dirt road, pull up to the gate. She got out carefully, as if she wasn't sure the ground would hold her. She walked toward me in shoes that were not made for walking on farm ground. I kept working. She stopped about 10 feet away and watched me for a moment. "Mr. Caldwell," she said. "Mrs. Whitmore." She was quiet. I finished the section of wire I was on, set my pliers down on the fence post, and turned to look at her. She looked older than she had at the restaurant. The restaurant version of Patricia Whitmore had been assembled: hair, posture, the particular expression of a woman who has decided in advance what the room should think of her. This version was just a woman standing in a field in the wrong shoes. "I didn't know," she said, "about the email, about what she was planning." "I believe you," I said. "I want you to know what she said to you at that table." She stopped, started again. She was not raised to speak to people that way. I looked at her for a long moment. The wind came across the north pasture and moved through the grass at the field's edge, and I watched it pass. "She was raised by you," I said. "Not cruelly, just as a fact that existed between us, the way the fence line existed, the way the field existed." Patricia's face changed. She nodded, very slightly. "Yes," she said. "She was." I picked up my pliers. "I don't hate your daughter, Mrs. Whitmore. I don't hate you, but I don't have anything else to say about it." She stood there another moment. Then she walked back to her car in those wrong shoes, and I heard the engine start, and I went back to the fence. I was not angry when she left. I was something quieter than that, and harder to name. Sadness, maybe, for the version of that evening that could have existed if different people had sat down at that table. But you don't farm for 42 years without learning that you can't grow what the soil won't support. You work with what you have. N. 3 months after the dinner at Harlan's restaurant, Thaddeus called me on a Thursday evening. I was on the porch with a glass of water, watching the light go out of the sky over the west field the way I'd watched it go out 10,000 times before. "I want to bring someone to Sunday dinner," he said, "if that's okay." Of course it's okay. Her name is Sarah. She runs the Pellerin farm over in Aroostook County. Brought in a sick calf last week. We talked for about 2 hours after I'd finished with the animal. He paused. She knew what blight-resistant potato varieties were. She asked me about the soil conditions here. She wanted to know about the history of the land. I didn't say anything for a moment. "Dad, bring her Sunday," I said. "I'll make enough stew." She arrived in a truck that needed new wiper blades and wore boots that had seen genuine work. She shook my hand the way someone shakes your hand when they mean it, looking at you, not past you. She asked about the barn before she asked about the house. At dinner, she told me about her grandmother, who had run the Pellerin farm alone for 11 years after her husband died, and the way she described it, the specific weight of that kind of work, the specific pride of it. I understood that she was not performing an interest in farming. She simply was a farmer. I watched Thaddeus watch her when she talked. I recognized the expression. It was the same expression I'd had 46 years ago, watching a woman named Ruth explain to me why the East Field drainage needed rerouting. Ruth had been right about the drainage. She'd been right about most things. After dinner, Sarah helped clear the table without being asked. She and Thaddeus washed the dishes together in the kitchen, and I sat on the porch with my coffee and listened to them talk, not the words, just the sound of two people comfortable in a shared space. It's a specific sound. You know it when you hear it. I did not say anything to Thaddeus about her that evening. I didn't need to. He knew what I thought. He'd always been able to read my silences accurately, even when he was a boy. In early June, I drove back to Harlan's restaurant on a Wednesday evening, not for any particular occasion. I had finished the season's first round of field work, and I wanted a meal I hadn't cooked myself, and I wanted to sit somewhere quiet. Simone was at the host stand when I came in. She looked up and smiled, not the professional smile she used for first-time guests, but the other kind. She led me to the corner table without asking where I wanted to sit. The one with the view of the room and the window onto the street. She brought me coffee before I'd opened the menu. I sat with my coffee and looked at the room. It was a Wednesday, so it was quieter than it had been on the night of the dinner. A few couples, a table of 4 near the window, a man eating alone at the bar with a book open beside his plate. The candles were the same kind as before, set in the same holders. One of them had burned down to a low pool of wax. I noticed it the way you notice things you've seen before. Chef Marcus came through the kitchen door about 20 minutes into my meal. He was a compact man in his 50s with the particular unhurried quality of someone who has spent decades in professional kitchens and made his peace with every kind of evening. He saw me. He stopped. He gave me a single, deliberate nod. I nodded back. He went back through the kitchen door. That was all. I finished my meal and sat with the last of my coffee while the restaurant slowly cleared around me. I thought about Ruth, who had sat across from me at a table not entirely unlike this one in the winter of 1981 and told me that the land was worth whatever it cost us to keep it. I thought about Thaddeus at 6 years old, following me through the barn in rubber boots 2 sizes too big, asking questions I didn't always know how to answer. I thought about the email and the words Margot had written in it, and the fact that she had written them at all, that somewhere in her, the calculation had seemed reasonable. I thought about Patricia standing in the north pasture in the wrong shoes, and the way she'd said yes when there was nothing else left to say. I didn't think about any of it for very long. There wasn't much left to think. The documents were filed. The land was protected. Thaddeus was washing dishes in my kitchen on Sunday evenings with a woman who asked about soil conditions. The candle on my table had burned down to nothing while I sat there. The wax had pooled and gone still. I left a good tip. I put on my jacket. I walked out into the June night, and the air smelled like the fields coming fully awake after the long cold, and I drove home on Route 9 with both hands on the wheel, the way I always have, the way my father taught me when I was 16 years old on this same road. The farm was dark when I pulled in. I turned off the engine and sat for a moment in the quiet. Then I went inside and locked the door. If you've ever sat in a quiet room after a long fight and felt something settle, not victory, not relief exactly, but the particular stillness of a thing finally made right, you already understand what that drive home meant. Some things take years to protect. Some things are worth every one of them. If these stories find something true in you, I'll be here.